So we definitely believe that how we grow matters, and we believed this back in 2002 when transit-oriented development was first introduced into the regional plan. Just to provide a brief history, transit-oriented development was adopted into the regional plan as a way to manage regional growth. To set the framework for transit-oriented development in the region, various policies were introduced. These included promoting land use design and street design to support transit and multimodal transportation options, prioritizing public investment in TOD areas to encourage efficient delivery of services, having mixed-use developments, promoting development at a human scale, requiring minimum densities and intensities to better support transit usage. Hold on 1 second.
My name is Dave Ziegler. I'm Director of Regional Planning, and I'd like to welcome you here tonight. This is a fifth presentation in the guest speaker series that this agency is putting on in this give you a quick rundown.
I did this to learn so that
Elaine Craig from Idaho Smart Growth and a member of the Boise City Council speak to us last fall. Also,
Okay, let me try this again. So I think where I left off was promoting development at a human scale, requiring minimum densities and intensities to better support transit usage, and ensuring that TOD corridors are linked to the community through multimodal access. The areas that were considered appropriate to support this type of development included the region's former north-south highway, which is Virginia Street, and east-west highway, which is 4th Street. The driving concept was that these areas could transition into higher residential and employment density areas that would make higher order transit feasible. By doing so, these areas would in turn promote a vibrant pedestrian-friendly atmosphere that has a reduced dependence on automobiles. Unfortunately, the TOD policies were adopted just prior to the recession, which makes it difficult to analyze their effectiveness in our region. The appropriate question to ask ourselves now is, what do we do moving forward? Is it TODs as they are implemented correctly, or some other approach to a mix of land uses and transportation that supports the effective use of public dollars and responsible growth? So to help us with that, we have G.B. Arrington here to share some various perspectives and expertise.
So you promised somebody else wants to start talking over my shoulder. So I've been doing TOD in government and as a consultant for about 40 years. So before TOD was an acronym. I actually live in a TOD. We're looking at the TOD that I live in right now because it's easy for me to take pictures of it because I just walk across the street. And it's also a bus TOD. So what I want to talk about are a few things. TOD, or TAD, and I'll tell you what that means in a minute. It's kind of some 4 things to think about that maybe you haven't thought about with TOD. Evolution of TOD and how that happens in regions and metropolitan areas and how long it takes. Some of the benefits, some best practice that's happening around the United States in implementation, and then some implications for Reno. And we're going to stop 2 times along the way and then at the end and have some discussion about some issues on that. So TOD, Transit-Oriented Development, or TAD, it's evil cousin. And the picture at the top is Cisco Systems, and they're the things that look like a herd of Kmarts with blue banding around along the edge of the roofs. And there's a great station at Cisco Systems, and they spent $100,000 for art at the station. And I like to tell people it's a great place to contemplate art because no one will bother you. And that's because there's a complete disconnect between transportation and land use there. And even though their name, Cisco Systems was at one time the highest valued company in the world, everybody has a parking space for their Porsche. And there's no reason for them to use transit, even though there's a beautiful light rail line out front. So it's not enough to be adjacent to transit. The development needs to be shaped by transit to be transit oriented. And the simple fact is that the majority of development at US transit stations aren't TODS, and that's because TOD is illegal at most transit stations in the United States because we require auto-oriented development in terms of densities, setbacks, and parking ratios. So it's not enough to be next to transit, we need to be shaped by transit. So what do I mean when I say TOD? It's not the Todd Motor Hotel in Las Vegas. It's things that are within a 5-minute walk to everything, close to home, office, shopping, civic uses. It's a district where transit creates value and shapes development. So those 4 things I mentioned that may surprise you in terms of transit-oriented development. The first one is that mode is not as important as you might think, because we tend to always think that TOD is about rail or high-order transit. And Todd works with bus or rail. Location, market, and transit frequency are all more important than mode. So it's the quality of the transit that's more important than the mode of the transit. That said, for shaping development, rail is nearly always better than bus, but we're not in a rail conversation here, but just as an aside. This is the Uptown District in San Diego, so it's a bus transit-oriented development project. It's an urban infill project, a former Sears store with a mix of residential, community center, office on a city-owned site. And what the city of San Diego was trying to do here was a demonstration project and to create some early bus-oriented TOD. The other thing is we're not talking about your father's bus line. To do transit-oriented development, there's a responsibility for the transit as well, because it's about community building and people moving. And so when I think of 21st century stations, whether it's a bus station like this one in downtown Redmond, just a stone's throw from Microsoft's headquarters, or a rail station, it's the city shaping with transit requires a new approach to transit as well. Quality design, making transit work, creating a place, connecting the place to the community. And so that's designing transit for walking to transit as opposed to driving to transit, which happens with a lot of systems. This is the Health Line in Cleveland. It's arguably the best BRT project in the United States. And part of it is putting it in the right place at the right time, because there's been $3.2 billion worth of development along the Health Line. All of that development would have occurred without the BRT, but with the BRT, they changed the zoning to require the buildings to come up to the street edge and to be walkable. So that action changed the nature and the shape of the development that would have happened anyway, but caused it to be walkable and transit oriented. So that zoning shaped the urban form. They've had a big increase in ridership, obviously, 60%, and it's a 6.8 mile long corridor with some big anchors like the Cleveland Clinic along the way. Distance matters differently for different uses. I think any of us that have seen kind of any presentations on TOD see circles and kind of the walkable area. Well, people walk different amounts for different things. And so transit share decreases with distance. And the first 600 feet really matter. So those of you that have been walking, drawing half-mile circles, you probably don't want to hear that, but unfortunately it's true. And office mode share drops about 1% for every 100 feet away from a station. So there's the most distance decay with office, but there isn't as much distance decay with residential. So if we look at these Washington, D.C. examples, right at the station, 35% of the people use transit, that's the transit mode share, but 54% use residential do. If we get a half mile away, only 10% of people half mile away are using transit, but 31% of the residential are. So what it says is, put the office and the retail closest to transit if you want it to be transit oriented. Kind of drilling in a little bit further, jobs near transit are more important than houses near transit. Because if we're using transit for a work trip, if there's no place to work along the line, it's kind of hard to use it for a work trip. So, the battery is dead. So, is this alive?
Yeah.
Sounds like it. Cool. We're adaptable. So with the sweet spot here, and this is research from Denver, is putting jobs and homes next to transit. And you can see the differences in the live only, work only, or live in, work, and what the mode share is. And those numbers go way up if we have corridors that do both things. The other part about transit-oriented development, and your conversation might be, well, how do we get started with it? For the people that are started with it, they're saying, well, it's no longer enough just to do transit-oriented development. We need to do more than transit-oriented development. We need to create complete communities. We need to push the market and market fundamentals further. We need to consider displacement and gentrification. We need to link economic opportunity, affordable housing, and good jobs. So maybe I'm telling you your next set of problems that you'll have once you start implementing more of this. And this is a Philadelphia infill example of doing some of that. So we're going to pause now, and we're going to turn this back to you. And you have note cards on your table. And what the staff would like you to do is to identify one problem with TOD in the region, and write that down on a Post-it note. And then write down a solution that the region should be pursuing related to advancing TOD on a Post-it note. And then walk to the back of the room, and there's a piece of paper that has problem on it and a piece of paper that has solution on it. And then we will reconvene after you've written down your problem and a solution. You don't have to write down your name, so you will not be held accountable.
Yeah.
So let's get
We
reading
gotta keep shaking it.
back in our seats. And you've had a chance for you to think about problems and solutions. And we're going to vary slightly from the planned, unplanned agenda and get a perspective from the development community that might have caused you to write different things down.
Thank you. I know a lot of folks in the room here, but Aaron West with Nevada Builders Alliance. In light of the fact that all the associated entities have been going through this master planning process, we've actually had a little working group involving NAIOP and the home builders, and you'll notice that I'm the only private sector guy here, right? So I drew the short straw. I want you guys to come up and throw some ideas out there, or maybe some perspective. Please don't do this as an attack on any of the entities, anyone here, or the TODs. If nothing else, hopefully I can convey maybe a perception from the private sector of where we're at right now with TODs. So, again, well, you can throw stuff at me, that's fine. In fact, I enjoy visiting large cities. I'm actually a huge fan of transit where appropriate, and as a developer, I love mixed-use development where feasible. So let's just start within those contexts. So the perception from the private sector that's working within the TODs on a daily basis is, in its most simplistic form, it's an attempt at social engineering through the imposition of planning and development standards to reduce vehicle use, right? So increase intensity, reduce parking, require pedestrian amenities, and that will theoretically should reduce the cars. In certain situations this makes sense, but when that intent and these standards are applied to the maximum extent of an existing sprawled form, it creates real challenges. I think that's some of what we run into. especially in a climate that is averse to pedestrians for several months a year. So I think we have some climate issues. I think we have some sprawl issues that make it a real challenge. So the issues from our, just some of the issues in talking with a lot of the professionals in the community that work in this environment on a day-to-day basis. So no one can, I don't want to pick on any jurisdiction, so I'm just going to make some blanket statements, and please don't steer me either way. But the perception from the professional community is not one of them can think of a project that went into the TOD that did not require variance from the standards by way of a special use permit. And there were over 40 examples that were provided. So if every project requires a deviation from the standards, is this not aspirational zoning? But if the SCPs continue to be approved, one has to ask, is this, are we, what's really the intent of the standards? And at some point it just becomes a revenue stream, right? If we're going to go through the process, they're going to get approved. So to be clear, because you guys work with all these design professionals on a daily basis, when I talk to them about this, they're not supportive of the development community's perspective. So the planners, the engineers, and the private sector don't necessarily, and it's pretty simple why, right? I mean, this is a revenue stream for them. They make a lot of money off of running these projects through. So in no way do they want to about that system. So a couple examples that came to mind, and again, there may be some generalizations in here, so please, don't blow it up completely. But if looking at industrial development within the TODs, right? So now Foods and Sparks, the recent projects by Germany and Panatonia, North Virginia. My anecdote was, I can imagine going to a national APA conference and explaining to someone that we developed a peaceful coexistence of pedestrian-friendly amenities and warehouse distribution truck traffic. So some of that, I think, is a little bit of a stretch, right? And the Panatonia project alone has a requirement for nearly $1 million in pedestrian amenities. And they're happy to pay it. Please understand that when I talked to Panatonia, they were completely happy with the project, with the approval, and what came out of it. But the reality of the future connections to adjacent properties and the meaningful continuation to housing and services from that location is a real stretch. So wouldn't those dollars be better spent on, for example, in the Stead area, on a pedestrian bridge across Stead Boulevard at the school, to try and prevent the backup of traffic from Stead Boulevard, a couple miles down US 395. So it's just, again, not a complete elimination, but maybe just a tweaking of where are those priorities and how are we spending those dollars. So another example is that, even in, the hippest neighborhood in Reno, Midtown, the thought of eliminating parking in favor of bike lanes was met with colossal uprising by the business community, right? So keep in mind that, the casual, quaint, eclectic, smattering of single-story buildings that are so popular today in the Midtown District would actually not be allowed by the current standards. It doesn't meet the intensity. So, I think this is something that we have to look at use, we have to look at the implementation of districts and really where it makes sense. Together with all of us have driven down South Virginia Street, the number of car dealerships, car washes, auto parts stores, and gas stations leads me to believe that, we're fighting an uphill battle in removing cars, right? And don't get me started on drive-thrus, right? So drive-thrus, Home Depot, that one cracks me up. Home Depot, I haven't seen anybody pack a lumber out of there on the bus. So the reality is we are not going to achieve the pedestrian bliss in corridors. Well, yeah, this is another part. We're not going to achieve that true pedestrian integration into a system like on South Virginia where we have 7 lanes and 55-mile-an-hour speed limits. Right? It's not conducive. So the real implementation of use of transit actually comes from traffic stagnation. I mean, there's a reason that folks take BART from Danville to into the city, right? It's 20 minutes on BART, or it's an hour and a half going across the bridge. And as a community, as long as we continue to have a 20-minute city as a priority, and we invest an amazing amount of money into infrastructure to support that 20-minute city, we're not going to achieve the pain threshold necessary to really drive other transit options. So some of the things that we're looking at is in a lot of cases letting the market drive the standards based on use. Currently we have potential users in the market that they know what they need in order to make it work. The standards that are currently in place don't necessarily work for them. So develop some common sense standards for street design where applicable that provide joint use of all pedestrian elements, employ a district approach to specific corridors, i.e. California Street, Midtown, choose those corridors and stick with the district approach, and focus on those of intensity, and recognize that those, in most cases, those districts are measured in blocks, not miles. So one of the best examples of live, work, play and multimodal use is actually down in South Meadows in the double R South Meadows Demonte Ranch area, and ironically, it's not in a TOD. It's developed organically. So again, I'm not advocating for removal of the TODs completely. I think there's some very specific corridors. We've talked a lot about the university down to the convention center, linking downtown Reno to downtown Sparks. I think those all have some very good merits. And I'm not advocating for the removal of the assessment for the pedestrian amenities either. I just think we could think a little harder about how we're using those dollars. So those are some thoughts from our end, and hopefully you guys can tell me where I'm wrong and I'll take the message back.
So I thought it was important to hear that perspective because at the end of the day, government plans it, but the private sector implements it. And so there needs to be that meeting of the minds about how to move these things forward. The TOD is complicated because it's a little bit like a relay race. It's a lot of different jurisdictions. It's the private sector. It's the financial markets. It's the regulators. And I know in my experience living in the People's Republic of Portland, we had to spend a lot of time with NAOP and others to figure out, well, how are we actually going to do this stuff? And how are we going to get a consensus? So I thought that was a good reality check on part of this. So the other part of the reality check is temporal. Getting to TOD is an evolution. And so I want to talk about kind of the evolution of TOD. And I'm going to start by showing you an extreme example. So Vancouver, British Columbia. So Vancouver is a place where they have tried to get rid of cars. They don't have one freeway. But it's also a place that the economists named as the most livable city in the world for 6 years in a row. So they probably are doing okay by that standard. If we look at the traffic standard, in 10 years, total trips, so these are all trips for all purposes and all modes. So walking is a trip and a car is a trip. Total trips went up by 23%, but vehicle trips within the city of Vancouver, not the whole region, so I want to make sure that I'm not cheating here, went down by 10%. So that's a little bit like asking a physicist, can a bumblebee fly? And they'll look at the mass of the bumblebee and its wings and tell you that a bumblebee can't fly, but it does. And the point there is, how can you have travel go up but trips go down? And the point here is it's because they've been working at balancing transportation and land use as part of a growth strategy for 40 years. They just didn't wish it to happen. They've been working at it for a long time. So what might that evolution look like for a city with transit to a transit city? And what are some of those building blocks to that transformation? And these are generalizations. Melbourne is one of the cities that displaced Vancouver. The other one that displaced Vancouver more recently was Zurich. So those are, not bad places either. So usually the TOD evolution starts with just getting started. And it's education, advocacy, it's coalition building, both public and public-private coalitions. It's adopting supportive policies, it's building the best practice library, it's going to visit the Portlands or Vancouver BCs or Washington DCs of the world to kind of kick the tires and get excited. Then places often move into getting plans in place, so you have plans and policies that are adopted. TOD is legal, which means that you don't have to go get an extra series of permits to be able to do TOD, but it's an outright permitted use, so you have the right to do it. Typically in those places, they focus on residential, and they focus on a few sites as opposed to trying to do this everywhere in the region. And transit agencies are often in the lead because they see more of a vested interest in doing that because they have the transit and the name is transit oriented. The next phase of it is, in the evolution, is focusing on the implementation. And that's where there are more district-based TODs, where plans, as opposed to allowing TOD, start to require TOD, and so that's your only option, or it's your only option without asking for a change. You've reshaped transit for TOD. There are lots of robust tools to help the private sector implement this stuff, and the city has taken over the leadership, so the transit agency really isn't at the table as much in terms of implementation. And I'll come back and talk about what a lot of those tools are in a bit. And then the fourth stage is that you transform the region. You've done enough of this where the market prefers TOD in many parts of your region. You're focused on more than just transit. It's about green and equity and jobs TOD. You have tight parking ratios. TOD has become part of your regional DNA, and the world needs a path to your door to see how you've done that. That hasn't happened very many places, to be fair. And it took a long time for it to happen in the places where it has happened. So then the question is, what do you aspire to be? You aspire to be a transit city or a city with transit. And it's kind of in the small print, but I'm comparing here Portland and Dallas. So Dallas has the largest light rail system in the United States. But it's a region that's been shaped by highways and sprawl as opposed to by the largest light rail system in the United States. So their transit ridership on a per capita basis is 14.7 trips per capita. Portland, with lots of transit but a smaller system, has a region that's been shaped by transit. It has 4 transit trips for every 1 transit trip that Dallas has. Because they changed the demand side of the equation by changing land use, as opposed to just the transit side of the equation. And that's where the big payoff is when we change land use and transportation, become a different type of a place. So some of the TOD benefits. For the transit agency, TOD typically means more riders at a lower cost because we put more development closer to transit. It also repositions transit as a means to the end of creating a livable community. So now transit's seen as a community building tool as opposed to just a safety net for people that can't afford to own a car. And the net result is you end up with more choice riders versus just focusing on commuters. And so it's riders for all trips for all purposes. And for the transportation geeks here, the issue with commuters is that work trips are, depending on the region, 18 to 21% of all travel. So if you're highly successful with 20% of something, that means you're probably not very successful with the 80%. So to get more to that transit region, it's also going to that all trips for all purposes. For the community, in the areas where you do TOD, you end up with less traffic, cleaner air, and healthier lifestyle. People that live in TODs have more money in their pocket because our second largest expenditure is transportation for household budgets. So you don't have to spend as much. If you live in a TOD, and you have more choices for housing, retail, and access to jobs. Now, this is probably cheating for this region. This is research that I did for the National Academy of Sciences. And this is based on developments that are next to rail transit, not bus transit. But it's comparing trip generation for auto trips compared to the ITE standards. And what we found was that TOD housing generates 50% less auto traffic than conventional housing. And you can look at trip generation, so it's 3.55 trips for multiple family in a TOD versus 6.67 for regular multifamily, or 10 trips per unit on a daily basis for single family, and those are auto trips. And then for the city, TOD means that it's an opportunity to leverage the implementation of their local plans for catalyzing economic development and for advancing mixed income housing. And this is increasingly what cities are looking for in doing TOD. The other thing that cities are doing, and this is the last thing before we go to the next question, is they're starting to focus and rank stations and trying to tailor strategies and the timing of implementation to where the market and development potential and underlying characteristics are already in place to support TOD. So go where you have the greatest chance to be successful and focus there. So places like Denver, the Bay Area, Twin Cities, Portland have all gone through that process to be able to say, where are we going to focus our efforts? And it's the logical next step from having a big regional map and say we're going to do TOD in a whole bunch of places to kind of winnow down to a few places. And then in many of these have strategies, different strategies key to needs. So is this a place that needs more planning? Is this a place where we're ready for implementation? Is this a place that needs infrastructure investment? So what are the kinds of needs in trying to differentiate? So some people that I've talked to indicated that we, meaning you, have too many areas designated as TODs in the region. I think we might have just heard that in the previous speaker, but implication wasn't clear. And so the question is, what do you think are the top geographic areas that have many of the preconditions for success for TOD in this region? So there are maps on the back of the wall, and each of you have a couple of dots, and what we're asking you to do is put the dots where the region ought to get started. What do you think those preconditions for success are?
So if you go back to the maps, the dots are like that.
Oh, okay. We didn't take the dots away from you. I'm sorry.
Right?
You have your dots.
That's what I figured.
it's very interesting to see some definite patterns to start to emerge where you put your dots in the back, and I don't know if that's just self-selection of the people that came to the meetings, or it's because you're the local experts and you know where the opportunities are, or it's a little bit of both. It's probably that. So what I want to do now, I'm kind of wrapping up, is talk about some of the best practices that are happening in other parts of the United States. And I apologize if I talk about things that you're already doing here, and so you can pat yourself on the back. Not all of these will make sense here, but it's more the spirit of the idea to kind of look at what other people are doing to move from planning the idea of TOD to implementation. And these are focused on the public sector and what the public sector is doing, but what you'll notice in a lot of these is that they're doing things to help make the private sector's job easier, because they've spent a lot of time with the private sector understanding what the barriers to implementation are and trying to remove the barriers to implementation. So I've talked a little bit about development-oriented transit, which is changing transit to be more development supportive. I talked a little bit about targeting stations strategically just before this as a way to tee this one up. Some places, a TODS is created staff that has the authority and the responsibility to work on TOD, as opposed to just saying that it's magically going to happen. Making TOD legal and easy, I think, is one of the real big things. Creating new implementation tools. And then one I wouldn't talk about in lots of other places that I'm going to introduce here is rebranding TOD, because maybe what you're talking about isn't transit-oriented development. It might be something else. And so maybe we're confusing the term. Let's talk about that. So development-oriented transit. So city shaping with transit requires an integrated solution, and that's balancing placemaking, great transit service, community fit, and private development. And it's the nexus of all of those things. Different people have responsibilities for each of those, and that's in part why I use the relay race example with TOD, because it's how do we get all the people in the room to work on these various different pieces. So creating a TOD czar. Interestingly, as the responsibility for TOD has moved more and more to cities, cities have decided to create a point person inside of the city to advocate, enable, and to facilitate the development of transit-oriented development. And so examples of cities that do that are the city of Denver, the city of Seattle, the city of Washington, D.C., or the District of Columbia, as we prefer to be called, the city of St. Paul, and the city of Minneapolis. Interestingly, the city of Minneapolis did it by getting a grant from the McKnight Foundation to pay the entire salary of their TOD coordinator, and then place that person as a city employee inside the city of Minneapolis. And what those people are doing is, by doing that, they're raising the profile of TOD and enabling an integrated approach. And a lot of them spend tons of their time with developers. So the one in Minneapolis was a former developer. He could speak development. He understood what the problems were that developers faced. The one actually in St. Paul is a former developer. The one in Seattle is a former developer. The one in Denver is a former city council member that was a union representative for a construction union. So he was on another side of the development curve. So a different kind of expertise than just the planning expertise to start to think about implementation. Another one that I think is incredibly important is to make TOD legal and easy. The challenge with TOD is that in most places it's discretionary, there are barriers, and there are extra steps. And so what you have to do is to, spend your time with your children or go to endless meetings and spend endless amounts of money on consultants to get what government has already decided as a good idea and to allow you to do what they're asking you to do. So if you think it's such a great idea, why don't you let developers do it? And maybe it's because you don't trust them to do it right, and we can get into that, but you're not going to get into it. They're going to have to get into it. And so what we want to do is we want to reduce the cost and uncertainty with the development community to implement transit-oriented development. Now, that also may mean raising the bar when you do that by looking you buy it. It's not just development next to transit, but where you have good transit, it's shaped by the development in some way. Maybe it's density, maybe it's mix, maybe it's parking. I think it would be a very long time before we park things differently here because of proximity to transit, because your transit's good. I said this, I could be wrong. I don't think your transit's good enough yet to ask the development community to park projects differently because it's next to transit. I don't think you have the level of service to do that. Or if you do it in a few places, and then give them the discretion to do that. Portland gave the discretion to develop apartments with zero parking in 1986. It didn't start to happen until 2006. And then it happened too much. So from 2006 to 2014, 47% of all apartments built in the city of Portland had zero parking. So the development community maybe overstepped in building with zero parking because they saw a strong market with millennials. They did it in places that had high quality transit service in the inner city that were already very desirable places. Not because government told them to do it, government gave them the option of doing it, the market moved, and they took advantage of the opportunity. So another thing is to build new TOD implementation tools. I don't know how robust your TOD toolbox is, but usually that's regulatory and financial incentives for TOD. So for the picture here, it used all of these. It used a city development corporation. It used city acquiring land and then offering it for development. It used regional TOD grants and funds, and then it used enhanced planning paid for with extra government funds on that site to be able to get an affordable mixed-use TOD on a light rail line, in the People's Republic of Portland. So it took a lot of things to be able to get the patent on the ground, other than just putting it in a plan. A number of agencies are now wrestling with the whole issue of housing affordability and using TOD as part of the strategy to deal with affordability and coming up with developer TOD grants. So you can see the list of places that are doing this, and each place has a kind of different flavor, but Portland, Denver, the Bay Area, Seattle, the Twin Cities. In part, that's the list because it's places where I work, so I know what they're doing. But it's also where a lot of the innovation is happening. The Twin Cities, in some ways, have gone the furthest. So they do grants for developers' due diligence. Now, I don't even know if most planners know what due diligence is, but it's the early at-risk work that the developer is doing where he has his own money at risk to do some of these projects. The government is saying, we'll be a partner with you in helping pay for that for TOD to help move the ball. In Portland, there are TOD grants from the regional government so that we lead getting to do development projects, to pay for what they call urban living infrastructure. It's part of helping the mixed-use development occur, and to do site acquisition. Again, I'm not saying these are things you need to do, these are examples of what other people are doing, just as they're building their toolbox. In Denver, there's a TOD fund, and it's a mix of public and foundation funding, so money from government, money from enterprise, and others. It's a $24 million regional housing fund targeting affordable housing sites. And the problem that they have in Denver is that the housing market is so strong that people doing for sale product can outbid or land people that want to do affordable. And the affordable people have to have big holding costs because then they have to go out and get tax credits and other things with no guarantee, and they can't afford to hold the sites. So what the TOD fund has done is it's invested $15 million to acquire 8 sites near transit, and then it's also preserved existing units and created new TOD units, so that the Evan Lofts is an example. Another thing that happens is enhanced TOD planning. And so, for example, as part of these bus rapid transit new starts, an eligible project activity for FTA is to pay for TOD planning with a small start or a large start. And so again, kind of that same list of familiar places, but also Atlanta and Los Angeles on this list of people applying for more detailed TOD planning. Essentially, the MPO or the transit agency passing funds through the cities to do more detailed site level planning. Los Angeles is the most extreme example of that. They've spent $21 million on TOD grants that they've given locally to cities to do detailed TOD planning around stations from their regional transit implementation funds. And those are on implementation focused projects. Seattle is looking at doing a similar thing. They have an $18 billion bond measure in November. They earmarked $20 million of that for affordable TOD funding that would come out of regional transit funding. And then MPO TOD developer grants for TOD programs, Main Street design. These are grants to developers to do dense mixed-use projects near transit. This is what they do in Portland. They fund site acquisition, that urban living infrastructure, technical assistance. They spend about $5 million a year on this. Since 1998, there were 35 built TOD projects as a direct result. They get in and they look at the developer's performance, they look at the construction drawings, they have people that understand the trade-offs in vertical construction and go to different development types. They can look to see what you can afford to do, and it's a but for their grant, you couldn't go to the next level of density or the next level of mix, and so that's what they'll fund. And they use 100% local funds to be able to do that. And then the regional government in the Twin Cities has what they call livable communities TOD grants. And those grants are the further TOD implementation, so that's they fund site assembly, efficiency, placemaking, publicly accessible infrastructure. In 2014, they invested $6.5 million, and it comes what they call the livable communities account, and the funding for that's 100% local. So let me wrap up with just some of my thoughts, and don't throw anything at me. I'm not a local expert, but I do know a lot about TOD. So what I want to say is, first of all, the fundamentals of TOD are the fundamentals of a great neighborhood. It's about, safe streets, strong centers, local services, parks, open space, a variety of housing choices, and good jobs. This TOD happens to be immediately adjacent to Intel's most sophisticated and most expensive plant in the world, where Intel architecture is, which is where they design the next generation of everything, and then they build it there for the first time. So in terms of moving TOD to the next level, it's my view that if I was here, I would want your partners to focus more on implementation. I would want them to focus on what's walkable and mixed use. I would want people to prioritize and focus on a few places where you can have impact. It's probably even fewer places than where the dots are back there. I would want you to think about expanding your toolbox because you know what you can do. You probably understand what the challenges are that the private sector faces or your other partners face, so how do you build that toolbox to do that? I think it might be important to throw the term TOD away because you frankly have too much of it on your map. Remember, I'm leaving, so you can forget about this after I leave tomorrow, if you want. But it's my view that, and I just used a wonky term, you probably want something that's better than that, but you know, really what you want to do is it's more about walkable urbanism, or it's transit-ready development, or it's, you know, it's whatever you want to call it. But TOD is a policy term. It is not a development product. Our developer friend will not be able to name one person that does TOD as a product because they do different things as products. They don't build TOD. So, you know, walkable urbanism or whatever you want to call it and TOD are essentially the same thing. If you start to ask developers to do TOD, you might have a private conversation with them and they'll tell you that, you know, buses aren't what I want next to my project because buses aren't carrying my customers. There's a bias there. I don't happen to agree with that, but I don't want to tell them that they have to do what they know how to do and put it next to transit. If a good place for what they do already happens to have transit there, why ask them to do TOD? You know, so borrow from established development products that are already in your region and look at what needs to be done to tweak those to make those more transit-oriented and more transit-supported. So, you know, at the end of the day, you want development shaped by transit in terms of greater density, less parking, better public ground, a mix of uses, things that are very walkable, and you know, we do want to tame the car. We want to make it behave. That doesn't mean banning it, but it means in some places making it go slower and being a visitor in these special places that we're trying to create. So that's the TOD that I live in. And our last exercise is, I think this is more of a conversation. And this is the question, and I'll ask maybe Kim to facilitate this so she knows more of who you are and she'll make sure that the important people get called on. I wouldn't know. But what are the next steps that you as a community can take to advance the implementation of TOD or whatever you choose to call it in this region? And that's what we'd like to talk about a bit right now.
Can I ask a more basic question? Based on the examples that you presented tonight, is there kind of a tipping point from a population perspective? Because obviously the areas that were highlighted are far more dense than we are. And also, when you get to that density, the price point tends to start driving. We're actually starting to see a little bit of it around here where single family is finally getting to a point where it's pushing folks into making choices of multifamily. But is there a balance there, or is that part of your start small and grow as the thing, you know, as the community grows?
Yeah, so I didn't include the examples, but I did a paper as part of this that got sent to a lot of people, and you know, places of the scale of Ogden or Boise or Albuquerque or the place down in Texas, right next to Mexico or something. But anyway, just the risk of being old, but those are all places that have TOD strategies and have been pursuing those. Boise in particular for the longest amount of time.
Great example. But to your point, Boise is twice us where, you know, everybody says, well, we should be like Portland. Well,
Well,
for fact.
I don't think there's anything wrong with being like Portland, but I might want to be like Portland in 40 years, and you may not like the medicine that it took to get to be Portland. To me, the question is, how deep is your market for walkable mixed use? And where are the places that would support that? And what are the amenities that the people that are going to live there want to have to add value? And then do more of that kind of development in those places.
I think the price point is finally getting to a point where there's some more activity downtown. We just haven't, from a purchase or even a rent standpoint, it hasn't justified the construction.
Right, and for those of you that don't speak development, what you just said is really, really important. You need to spend a lot of time with real estate economists and understand what your land values will support. That's why a lot of those funds are there. Because even in places like Portland or Denver, to get the kind of built product that they want, the real estate economics will not support it. So what the government has done is to say, okay, if we got more of this product built, and we had more comparables, and we had more experience within more of the small parts of the living community, some of the smaller banks, and experience with developers, can we then accelerate implementation and do more of this? So I think it's very much going to be kind of a bootstrap approach of starting with a few things and understanding real estate fundamentals and why just giving somebody a density bonus doesn't really help because the real estate economics wouldn't support the density. You're giving the developer something he can't use. That doesn't mean I'm not pro TOD. It just means that we've got to live in the real world. So, over there?
So I'll answer your question here on the screen. As you hinted, the next step should be to stop calling it a TODS. I think a great consumer-friendly name is walkability or walk rating. Like for the buildings, which few people even know what even stands for anymore, but you know that I want a platinum LEED building, not a silver LEED building. Or I think private organizations can set standards and ratings and have a project with a walkability scale or walk friendly or something cool with walk in the name, and have it based on proximity to transit, fewest interactions with untamed automobiles, kind of the stand, not just nice sidewalks, but how to get to other modes of transit. So I look forward to the Reno Master Plan dumping TOD during it in philosophy, adopting a better name.
Yeah, and Chris Lineberger at Brookings and Smart Growth America, they released a brand new report last week on walkability, and I can get you the URLs and things like that, or it's on my computer. And it's the 2016 version, and we also released one in 2014. And it's a good kind of analysis of what you're talking about.
I lived in San Francisco last year, and San Francisco is an interesting place where even though it's quite walkable, you oftentimes really benefited from owning a car. Unless you live and work along the main transit lines, it just was not feasible to take transit. And I saw the incoming mobility as a service, Ubers, the Lyfts, really making car ownership no longer necessary because
question. I think the major corridors won't go away because whether they were, footpaths, 200 years ago, or then they became wagon paths, and then they became streetcars, and then they became big streets, and then they went back to streetcars again. Those major corridors are still there, and here, you have a few major corridors, but that may not happen for any of those corridors. Not on this list, but certainly places like Toronto and San Diego have been spending a lot of time with what they call mobility hubs. So at different stops along their lines, how do they deal with that last mile or last 5 miles and using Uber and Lyft and bikes and other things. I think the jury is still way out on autonomous vehicles and what's going to happen on that, so I'm not going to speculate on what's going to happen with autonomous vehicles. But I think that, I know that the technological changes in transportation that we've just been talking about in the last 5 years they're transformative. And certainly I think about my kids in Portland and how they get around. And the people that live in my same unit that go to Costco with a zip car because they don't own a car. They own a moped, but they can't go to Costco on a moped. But she only goes to Costco, she owns a restaurant, so she goes to Costco a lot. But she can do it with a zip car, so she doesn't need a car.
Several of us in this room have pledged our community to
Yep.
and you work on creating streetcars. He said one of the keys was looking at the spot on Portland Street, downtown John, and neighborhoods. So I think, to try to answer your question, we probably need to focus on what 2 or 3 or 4, 5, and 6 things in close proximity to each other we want. That's probably good walkable,
Yeah, and I completely agree with John, and I just expand on maybe what he might say, because some of those are connecting the places that will be, because the Pearl District required the streetcar to become the Pearl District, and John was a developer in the Pearl District, and the places that already are. So, I did this in downtown Fort Lauderdale, in planning the light rail, the streetcar right there the way. And what we did was, we said, don't tell us the engineering feasibility to get from here to there and then the plan the alignment. Tell us what your most important places are, and then we'll tell the engineers to figure out how to connect them. So yeah, I think that's important. You balance the aspirational of where you're trying to change and what you already have and build on the nexus of the two.
I don't suspect those 3 areas have already emerged in the basketball process. The city talks about the university. So that means that universities talk about those things.
Yeah, it started in a smaller list of places, and maybe your regional plan doesn't change. You might change some of the brandings. You still want to do a bigger, longer-term thing, but you got an implementation strategy within the regional plan and within the local plans that's more focused on discrete places.
Hi, Robert. I'm Jenny Breckus, Ward 1 City Council member. I think I was the first person, when we had the conversation about my capacity on the Regional Planning Board to engage with y'all, and I haven't met you yet, so hi. I think that to answer your question, looking back to the TODs, how they came in Reno was like 2005, 2006. They were really zoning documents, not supported by, really a plan process or really a framework of planning hierarchy. So as we move through with the master plan, which is a big priority for me and it's going well, I've been emphasizing or inquiring what's our next step in terms of establishing our planning hierarchy. Whether it's, we've had some experience with neighborhood planning, what those have pulled out. We have a lot of plan unit developments, which are planning tools and zoning. And then we haven't done a lot of area plans. And then also, obviously your rank 2 plans, your mobility element and so on. So that's what I'm looking for to come in next, is to establish that planning hierarchy. I think that's been part of why we've suffered. In addition to, now that I see David, in 2006 we set up this TOD framework, and then immediately the sales tax dependent transit system crashed when sales tax went down so much, because we don't have a real dedicated funding source. So, I do think it's time to kick it up. But the cities you work in, they don't get rid of all these planning frameworks and hierarchies, areas, and started my career in Albuquerque. I mean, they had a very, rank 2, rank 3, the whole thing, and you still see this in a lot of the cities, right?
Right. So let's use Denver as an example. So Denver started with Blueprint Denver to be able to say, here are the areas of change, here are the areas of stability, and in change work, all the kinds of things that were focused more on transit. And then they went and they did those kind of neighborhood-based plans for every transit station in Denver, and that took about 5 years. And then they rewrote their zoning code to be able to implement that. And then they embedded TOD in public works and economic development, and appointed a TODS and then changed their kind of implementation priority to say these kinds of stations will do these things and these kinds of stations will do those things. Because you as an elected official understand, you never say no to the station. It's just a different kind of yes. Yes, you're important, but you're ready for more planning as opposed to you're ready for implementation. So we're going to bring you different kinds of tools. And that sophistication of saying different kinds of tools for different places, I think, starts to show the nuances of implementation.
Hopefully I don't get something thrown at me again. In terms of next steps, one thing that comes to mind, and this really hit home when I spent some time in Boise, is if we as a community, I know that to some degree we're still dependent on I don't want to say the casinos because they've really developed more of the resorts, but the tourist model. A lot of what I saw and what you talked about here really had very little to do with that tourist bound. It was about developing organically and taking care of your residents through your. And so I get frustrated when I hear about light rail. The priority on the light rail right now seems to be to connect downtown to the convention center. And that's all based on tourism. That has nothing to do with the walkability and the people and anything like that. So if there's anything that I could throw out there from a next test, can we start thinking about us as a community and less about all those folks that we're trying to drag here to get a couple $100 out of?
Well, it's probably a little bit of both. One of my clients is Disney. And so for the Anaheim Resort, they were very, very interested in obviously getting dollars out of people's pockets. And for Disney, the car was a threat in 2 ways, because it took parking spaces, so they had less land to develop for other things. And then if you had a car, you could drive it to other places in Los Angeles. And so, if you relied on transit once you got here, you were acting captive, but they were questioning who that was. But they, have been big advocates of transit all over the world because it's part of improving the customer experience for their resort customers. So, you can slice these things lots of different ways. And I've been doing this for 4 years, so I couldn't give you every example that I have. Anything else, or you want to go home? Or change those plans?
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate your presentation this evening. Being here with us. So thanks very much. I believe we actually have a product that we do, okay, that brings together the one problem, one solution exercise that we worked on. And as we're bringing this together, I'll kind of do some quick announcements. One is that the next public meeting in terms of the regional transportation plan for RTC is July 28th from 5 to 7 p.m. at the Nugget. If you've signed in with us, we will go ahead and share that email so that you get the email regarding that particular event. I'd also like to say thank you very much for making the time to come this evening. We really appreciate it. This is, as I mentioned at the beginning, kind of the first of these discussions. We've already started working with GE around what we'd like to do kind of our next conversation around this. So we will continue to reach out to you. We appreciate that. No problem. There's cookies in the back, don't be shy. As you hand it out, maybe take a snack to go, some water, everything you take, we don't have to carry downstairs, so don't worry about that. So some of the things I thought were pretty interesting about the presentation when we were waiting, we spent some time with Julie today, and part of what we talked about was this idea of kind of transit-ready development. And so, is it necessarily something that in the next 5 years, this is something that we need to be thinking about as Julie talked about the kind of implementation over time. When he shared with us that Portland put in 6 lines over 30 years, so roughly, right, that's about 1 line a year. So they started in about 1986. That helped put some perspective for me on that, around kind of what the expectation can be. Because these are definitely some large dollar amounts that we were talking about. So we thought that kind of idea around transit ready, especially when we think about demographics, changing demographics in our region, is one of the pieces we're going to talk about at our next session. And it looks like we're really close here to having what we've done is create word clouds for the one problem and a word cloud for one solution. And it's the first time I've seen it. Which is which? Okay. All right. So what do we have here? And we had no idea if this was actually going to kind of create something that would be compelling, but we thought we could give it a shot. It looks like under problems, we have the word topic times. I think that's interesting, and maybe not all that surprising after our conversation today. So that's kind of interesting. And then what I do think is kind of interesting, transit is listed as both a problem but also a solution. And I see also development, I see core, I see routes, I see jobs. And I think what I really see here is a lot of thoughtfulness around kind of these topics and these subjects that you put in there for us. So we're going to take this as part of our day